welcome to the Convex Conversation with me, broadcaster Helen Fospero. Today's guest spent 30 years climbing the ranks of the Metropolitan Police, from a bobby on the beat to leading on high-profile cases, murders, bombings, kidnaps, extortion, investigating corrupt cops on the Ghost Squad, and briefing prime ministers on terror threats to the UK. When Neil Basu left the force as Assistant Commissioner, he was the most senior officer of colour in the UK and had been the first Asian officer to run counter-terrorism. But as we'll hear, his rise came at a hefty price. He witnessed and experienced discrimination at every level for being brown. Dad was an Indian-born doctor, Mum a Welsh nurse, and the shocking spectre of racism weaved its way through his high-flying career. Racism was evident from day one, when he was a young, fresh-faced recruit, with the murder in 1993 of 18-year-old black teenager Stephen Lawrence, stabbed to death by a gang of white youths. Neil has just brought out a personal account of what it was like to serve for the biggest force in the country, a career he devoted his life to. Turmoil, 30 years of policing, politics and prejudice, reveals the shocking truth about modern policing, the influence of politicians, the press, and the enduring racism with little appetite for change across the profession they call the job. Andy's here in our Convex Conversation studio to tell us more. Neil, it's wonderful to meet you in person. As a journalist, I've seen your career develop and probably covered your press conferences, etc. But before we start properly, you've actually joined my podcasting world now, haven't you?
I'm so sorry. I didn't come here intending to gloat about being your competition. I think you're doing better than we are at the moment, but that's a bit of mutual reinforcement and collaboration, as your producer just told us to do, would be a great thing.
How is it going? Are you enjoying hosting the podcast?
I actually love it, largely because, as my wife would say, you get to do that chitty-chatty thing you like doing, and somebody now pays me to do it, instead of sitting at home and ranting at the television or at the newspaper. It's incredibly important to me because I very often get asked to do media interviews. I very often turn them down. Unless it's a really important issue, I don't really want to do that kind of thing. I don't want 2 or 3 minutes to try and explain an incredibly complicated, wicked problem on air, which is largely taken out of context, is largely not long enough to explain anything. And of course, the podcast format gives you a unique opportunity to get into the detail, and hopefully people are listening, just like yours.
Thinking of your wife, are you quite annoying when you're watching crime dramas? Because are you correcting?
I'm annoying when I watch any kind of television. I sort of run in commentary and I'm very fidgety. But yes, crime dramas particularly. The hilarious thing is, any police officer you ever meet that tells you they don't enjoy crime dramas is lying to you. It's the reason we're all cops. So I can tell you, I can go right back to the Sweeney. Most of the people I know in the flying squad still have a leather jacket because they want to be Regan and Carter. Sweeney, Hill Street Blues. I can go through a whole series. My favourite detective, Columbo. There is a reason why we become police officers. We get fascinated with that kind of stuff. So I watch almost every crime drama you can possibly think of.
But are you correcting things? Like if you're watching something like The Blacklist now, are you saying to your wife, that's not how it's done?
The Blacklist, excellent. I do watch that. Yes, unfortunately, my wife is a very, very impressive published criminologist. So there's not a lot I can tell my wife about crime that she hasn't already researched, written about, and knows in far greater detail than me.
Now, your book is gripping, it's raw, it's honest, and it makes really uncomfortable but very important reading at certain points. What made you write it, Neil?
Kathy Newman, friend of mine who you'll know, who presents on Channel 4, told me to write a book after my valedictory interview. It's a terrible name for a final interview, but the last day I served was 30th of November 2022, and Kathy interviewed me and put out the interview, and afterwards says, you should write a book. And I laughed that off. And she said, no, I'll introduce you to my publisher and my agent. You can have a chat with them about writing a book. I went for coffee, and the agent quite rightly said to me, it seems like you've got a lot of interesting things to say, but the most interesting stuff are the stuff you don't want to write down. And that was really good advice. I couldn't pitch to him why I wanted to write this book. And then in January, a couple of months later, a young literary agent wrote to me and said, I saw your interview with Kathy. I think you could write a book. Give me a call. And I went for a coffee with her, and it went from there. And it is an uncomfortable read, and it was an uncomfortable thing to write. It was also very cathartic to write it. I describe this as a love letter to policing. It is not something that says policing is I think it's one of the most noble and important of professions, and The people who do it well, the best police officers that you meet, are the very best of us. Unfortunately, the worst ones are the very worst of us. So there is this sort of double-edged sword to this particular profession. But it's incredibly ironic that we call it the job, because it really isn't a job. It is a vocation. For many of us, it's our entire identity, and I cannot tell you the trauma. I couldn't even hand my warrant card back in. My wife had to take it to the Commissioner's office on my behalf because I couldn't bring myself to walk into New Scotland Yard and hand over what was effectively my life and identity for 30 years. It was really tough.
You were really, really passionate about your career, weren't you?
Yeah, I mean, many of us are. It does sort of define us, but there are other careers, obviously, which are vocational. But I describe policing as a career where you regularly put the families and the families of strangers before your own on a regular basis. And there is a selflessness to it. But I mean, I always describe that selflessness as also a bit selfish, because you do get a tremendous sense of pride and satisfaction, and all the kind of things that you need from work you get from helping people at the worst time of their lives. It sounds selfless, but actually it's the job. It's what you're paid to do, but it is incredibly demanding. And I think anyone who thinks they know police officers should read the book, because I wrote it for 3 specific reasons. The first was so that people might understand why understanding and accepting institutional racism as a problem might make us a more effective police service. So there is a business case, not just a moral case, for my views on institutional racism. But the second 2 points were really important to me. The first was, this is the physical and emotional toll of being a police officer. And if it can do that to me as an assistant commissioner, driving the mahogany bomber, as my wife jokes, the last executive part of my career wasn't exactly kicking doors in at 2 a.m. But if you can do that job, what it does to you physically and emotionally is dramatic. And I sit as a trustee on a police charity that deals with mentally and physically damaged cops, and the mental health trauma has increased massively in the last 5 years. So that's something to think about. And the last thing is what it does to our families. Every commendation ceremony I've either been handing out the medals or been a part of, we always praise the family. We always say thank you, for lending us your loved one to do this very important service. And we say it at the commendation ceremonies, and then there's a sort of guillotine where the family's never mentioned again, and we don't understand what's happening to families at home. As a friend of mine described it, this different planet to do this job that is almost impossible to describe. I think I've had a go in the book, but it's almost impossible to describe what it's like to some people who will never experience the kind of horrors you read in that book.
And it did come at a personal, hefty price for you too, didn't it? Those very long hours and being away from the family and the children, for such long periods of time, and dealing with things that would keep most of us awake for the rest of our lives, dealing with some real horror stories.
I'm lucky. I mean, I'm lucky because I reached a level where I could afford my own private counselling when I left. But I'm not ashamed to say I had a year of counselling to be able to transition from what was an incredibly high-stress job into retirement. I don't think I would have coped without the brilliant Dr. Jenny Jones. I'm going to say her name here. Fantastic that she happened to be Welsh as well, so she reminded me of speaking to all of my Welsh relatives at the time. That made the conversations much easier. But trying to get your life back in perspective when it's been like that. I mean, the last 7 years of my career were in counter-terrorism, and you are on call 24/7, 365 days a year, wherever you are in the world. The only time I could relax was when I got on a plane, because, I could have a drink, and even if I got drunk, by the time I got to the end, if I got recalled back to the UK, I'd be sober by the time I got back. So that was a relaxing thing. And then they put Wi-Fi on aircraft.
Oh, no.
So, it was
everywhere now.
Very, very upsetting. But you think you're coping really well while you're doing it because the adrenaline keeps you going. And it's amazing how long that boiling frog syndrome can last. And then the day you stop, and I stopped doing the counter-terrorism job on the 4th of July, 2021. For my American friends, I described that my very own Independence Day. It is amazing how quickly you realise that you are in trouble. All my medical vitals went back to normal 6 months later without me going anywhere near a gym. So, it wasn't that I changed my lifestyle or anything. It's just I didn't do that job anymore.
What made you realise, Neil, that actually going to see Dr. Jenny Jones would be really useful? Because men are notorious for being a bit more reluctant to go and talk things through. But were there certain things that were happening in your life that made you think, actually, I need to go and get some help to sort of fathom all of this out? Or was it just such a drastic change from living and breathing your world in the police to suddenly not being there?
I had a very good friend who was head of operations at MI5 who spent 18 months before they retired getting physically fit and mentally prepared for their retirement and planning a wonderful retirement. So travelled around the world for a year, and he was my role model. And I thought, that's the way to do it. And I thought in my head, I thought I was on that journey. I thought I was decompressing well. I thought I was getting fitter. All my medical stuff was getting better and better and better. And I thought that was going to be okay. And then the final day came, and the realization that I wasn't ready for this. And of course, you've read the book, so you know my exit wasn't entirely voluntary from law enforcement.
No, it wasn't.
I'm sure we'll get into that. So I was left feeling incredibly proud of what I had done, but also sort of bitter and angry that I couldn't carry on. I was invited a few months later by Doreen Lawrence and the family to Stephen's 30th anniversary. But that 30th anniversary event, which I opened the book with, was sitting in the church in St Martin in the Fields in London, listening to the trauma that family had been put through and the trauma of institutional racism, being called out by the mayor, being called out by Keir Starmer, who was the shadow at the time, and challenging the Metropolitan Police to do something about it, and listening to the response and thinking, I was the most senior officer of colour in the country, only the fourth to reach my rank since 1829. So what did I do? What did I do that we could still be having this conversation in 2023? I felt like I'd wasted my time. I felt like I'd wasted my career. And then a few months later, my friend Louise Casey wrote this incredibly damning report on the Metropolitan Police after the murder of Sarah Everard by a serving police officer who actually worked in one of my commands. So there was a double edge to it. And also I was one of the people she interviewed for that report. So I felt like both a victim of it and a perpetrator as a member of the management board. And she invited me in to have a sort of critical read of it before she published it, along with 6 other very, very impressive people. But none of them were police officers, and they were all utterly shocked by what they read. I read it. I wasn't shocked because I've been in this profession for 30 years, but I was pretty distraught. I mean, I walked away from Camden Town Hall where we were meeting. I was crying as I walked away. I thought, God, I hope nobody sees the ex-head of counter-terrorism in tears walking down. Nobody wants to see that, but it was horrific.
But it was a damning report because didn't she say that the Metropolitan Police is still institutionally racist, homophobic and misogynistic?
Yes. And effectively reading that report made me realise that in 30 years we hadn't made enough of a difference, and I hadn't made enough of a difference. I mean, I was a very senior person. I mean, I describe in the book things I tried to do. You know, I was a young sergeant on the Lawrence Inquiry team trying to get the Met to understand what it needed to do to reverse the damning conclusion that we were institutionally racist. I'd led various diversity boards as I got more and more senior, and I sat on the Met Management Board, and I did try and persuade National Police Chiefs Council in the year before I retired to accept institutional racism before they launched their National Race Action Plan. The trouble is, they said no. And I thought I had convinced them. And of course, the Chief Constable who argued against me and saying effectively policing isn't institutionally anything, well, they sided with him. And that's when I decided to retire. I thought, I can't change this. I thought I was a well-respected voice inside my profession, but they've decided to go with this burying their head in the sand, which I've seen for 30 years since Stephen was murdered brutally in Eltham back in 1993.
And I think it became clear to you, didn't it, as the top job beckoned or was on the horizon. I think it was Cressida Dick was leaving, wasn't she? And the commissioner's job was up for grabs. But I think up for grabs sounds a little bit flippant, but you know what I mean. But I think you realised that as you got bolder and said more, you weren't going to be allowed to say the things you wanted to say if you were to become commissioner. Am I right in thinking that was in your mind too?
All of that's true, silent from one thing. I'll tell you a funny story. I walked into the front of New Scotland Yard after Cress had resigned and they'd opened the books on who was going to be the next commissioner. And for a while I was in the papers as the number one candidate in the country for that job. And I remember walking into New Scotland Yard and the teams that do security at New Scotland Yard all work for me. Lovely people, smile on their face saying, our money's on you. I said, please tell me you haven't gone down to Ladbrokes and put any money on, because I haven't applied. It was never my intention to apply to be commissioner. Cress and I had various conversations. She wanted me to replace her when she was ready to give up the job. I never wanted that job. I was a former commissioner's staff officer. I've served 10 commissioners, including 2 acting commissioners. Only John Stevens left with his reputation, mental and physical health intact. When you see that job up close, you understand just how bad that job is. I had the best job in the world for a detective, head of counter-terrorism. The second best job would have been to have been Director General of the National Crime Agency. They weren't going to give me that job either, and I spent 5 months trying to be the head of the National Crime Agency. The Cabinet Office stepped in and stopped the process.
And why is that? Is that because you were willing to step out and say what you thought and call things out?
Certainly after George Floyd, after his murder, I'd sent a blog around. So I ran specialist operations and I was the national head of counter-terrorism. So I had 10,000 people working for me across the country leading that sort of counter-terrorism effort. And I'd sent an internal memo to them saying, really, it was to my white colleagues to try and get them to understand how black and brown officers that they were working alongside might be feeling about this event. It was immediately leaked to the Daily Mail, so not everybody enjoyed it. So I gave it to Catherine Viner at The Guardian, who very kindly printed it in full and made no editorial comment. I've never seen or heard of that ever since. But it was very kind of her because it got the message out. But then that became a bit of a cause célèbre for a while. People started to talk about their experiences inside the Met, so I think it had something to do with people starting to stand up. It was because a black female superintendent who worked for me had written to my deputy after George Floyd was murdered and said, nobody has said anything about this. Not the Prime Minister, not the Commissioner, and not my boss, and she meant me. So it wasn't even my piece of leadership, it was hers. Her name's Jenny Barnett. She's absolutely amazing. Hopefully she's going to be Assistant Chief Constable up in Suffolk. She doesn't mind me saying this, but it was her leadership putting me to the sword to say, do something about this. Made me write that. That obviously got me front and centre in the media about this sort of my diversity credentials. A particular right-wing commentator called me the super woke so-called head of counter-terrorism. And I thought, and my friends all laugh about this as well. Woke for me is in the Oxford English Dictionary. It is about being alert to racial and social justice. I think if you can't be that, you're no friend of mine, and you really shouldn't have a badge. You shouldn't be in law enforcement when your job is to provide a service to everybody, not just the people you like. The way woke has been twisted in the culture war to become this extreme left censorship, defunding the police, that's nothing to do with me at all. I'm way back in the civil rights movement of the United States, saying this is about unfairness to people of protected characteristics. And the trouble is, policing still has this problem. It's not all of policing by any stretch of the imagination. 80% of the people I served with over 30 years are phenomenal people who are keeping us all safe, and we should be grateful for them every day. But about 20% of them are either lazy, incompetent, corrupt, or prejudiced. And sometimes all four of those things. You can retrain the incompetent, you can remotivate the lazy. The corrupt and the prejudiced have got to be got rid of. And your job as a leader is to hire well, so you don't hire those people in the first place, and fire people who can't reach that level of values. And for me, that's what woke means, is that I understand that not everybody can be treated equally because they've had a different life experience, and I should appreciate that and do something about it. That's what it was for me. That is not the way a certain conservative administration, it's not all conservatives, I work brilliantly with some of them, but some of them viewed me as a kind of, this warmonger in this war on woke. And certainly I know this for a fact because a former chief whip of the Conservative Party rang me up to apologise for the political lobby briefing against me being the next commissioner.
Wow.
So I knew I was never going to be commissioner, even if I had applied. The fact that I applied to be Director General of the NCA was me trying to say I won't be bullied out of the top two jobs in law enforcement. I knew I didn't have any chance in that either. But 5 months later, I'm doing really well, and I'm in the last two of the process. So I'm thinking I'd kind of forgotten my position in society, and I thought I had a chance. And when it was snatched away from me at the last minute, and the guy who got it, Graham Bigger, is a friend of mine, he's brilliant. If they'd just given it to him in the first place, and I'd never have written that book, probably. I would be bitter.
Maybe, yeah, exactly. Well, I'm glad you did write the book. And one thing that really struck me reading it was how many times in that book you beat yourself up for not doing more.
God, you're not the first person to say.
In my humble opinion, I think you tried to make incredible progress and you were very aware of what was going on. But you do seem very frustrated that you couldn't do more. Tell me about that.
Well, I'm hoping it's not performative. I mean, it's quite funny because the one person who's read that book who said, that's absolutely Neil Basu, is my wife. who is a very, very highly qualified sociologist and criminologist. So I think she knows a little bit about the human mind. So that's good, because when I was writing, I was thinking, even Jenny, my sort of counsellor and coach, effectively said, you're being far too hard on yourself. The trouble is, I've been like that my whole life.
Have you?
And that is not a great character trait. It should be a very positive thing. You know, when something goes wrong, if you're leading a particular, in my old world, an operation or an investigation or a huge critical incident and something's gone wrong, my first thought is always, how did I play a part in that? If it's gone wrong, what did I do that's made it go wrong? The looking in the mirror thing that they teach you on all kinds of leadership courses, that's just a natural reflex for me. Now, that can become paralyzing if you constantly think that you are the problem. I was never like that. I mean, for me, the positive thing about that is you always start to examine absolutely everything that happened and what may have gone right and what may have gone wrong. It's the way you learn from something that may look like a disaster, but you can learn from it for next time. That became a very positive trait in my career, but it's a very debilitating one personally. Because every time something of this magnitude, the fact that we're still talking about prejudice in policing 30 years after I started, made me think that I must somehow be culpable for that.
I thought it showed real humility and real care and empathy, and just that you were just frustrated that you just couldn't do more. But I think you did do an awful lot and have done an awful lot.
That's incredibly kind of you to say that.
I mean that.
Even saying it out loud, it sounds a little bit self-serving when I say it out loud. But the one thing the turmoil bit is, I knew if I had done and said the kind of things I said in 2020 after George Floyd, when I was an assistant commissioner, so I was an AC in the Met, the equivalent of a chief constable, I'd never have written that as a police constable, because I knew that would have been the end of my career. And I knew so many people who stood up and fought for people as PCs, sergeants, inspectors, who never got any further in their career, or could have been future chief constables but burnt out early on, because they did a lot more than I did. Now, I got to the top, so when I get there in 2020 and I start talking, the worst thing that happened for me is I also got taken out at the knees. I was really nervous that people would see what had happened to me. I sort of kept it to myself till I wrote the book, because I was thinking, people are reading the book going, oh my God, if it can happen to you as an AC, I'm not going to say a word. And nothing's going to change unless people stand up and say something about it. And this prejudice thing is a really interesting thing. I talk about racism because I know more about that than anything else, because I'm a mixed-race man. But I don't mean it to be just about racism. It's about the concept of prejudice. So I think the actual problem is bullying. And if you come from a profession like mine, which is a very assertive, alpha, male-dominated environment, it's a very macho profession that requires in lots of situations very alpha behaviour. The old-fashioned nature of leadership in policing was command and control. It is an authoritarian, ex-military discipline. There's still way too much of that in policing. That is not the modern way to lead anyone, and was never my leadership style, I hope. You might get a few people ringing in saying, I work for him. But the reality is, I don't think you get the best out of people with that kind of approach, but it benefits bullies. And the bullying is, it doesn't matter what your protected characteristic is, whether you're female, gay, black, brown, neurodiverse, physically disabled, bullies will pick on you for that. We've known that since we were children.
Bullies will pick on you, and many bullies will call that banter. And I love banter, but I'm not a bully. Banter is not the same thing, is it?
I love banter as well. I've been part of sports clubs since I was 5 years old. So I've just come back from the British and Irish Lions with 10 former rugby pals. I understand what banter is, and I understand when it is not banter anymore. So anyone who's lived as long a life as I have, looking like this, can spot a malicious racist from about 200 feet away before they open their mouths. I can spot people who are clumsy, who are telling jokes that are inappropriate for the era that they're in, and I can forgive all of that. And some of that can be banter. But you have to have particularly thick skin and be particularly resilient to be in a boys' club where people are trying to bully you into submission. And a lot of people tend to withdraw inside themselves in those circumstances. I use the expression, I don't know whether I can swear on your podcast.
You can swear on our podcast.
But so I use the expression in the book, which is an old military expression, which is fit in or fuck off. And I learnt as a very small child, growing up in an all-white community in an all-white town, going to all-white schools, that the easiest way to survive in 1970s England when I was 3 years old at my first school was to fit in, or I'd be told to fuck off. So you learn very quickly to assimilate into a white person's world when you look like I do. And you put up with the banter. At least you're not like them, play the white man. These were expressions not used by people who bullied me. These were the expressions of my best friends, some of whom are still my best friends. But luckily, they've known me for a very long time and they've grown out of this kind of behaviour. But that kind of banter is simply prejudice and simply racism. And it reminds me of the book the Yorkshire cricketer wrote. It's not banter, it's racism, is the title of his book. The Yorkshire cricketer who was, that was a cause célèbre for a long time because of racism in that institution. I have family members who are very high-level amateur cricketers who live in Yorkshire, and it was all very distressing at the time. And as soon as I saw the name of that book, I understood immediately what that feels like. For people who aren't as, brassy as me, when I joined the old Bill, I was nearly 25. I was 6 foot and 100 kilos. You had to be pretty ballsy if you were going to be racist to my face. So you don't suffer the same kind of bullying, perhaps, that other people who don't have the physical stature or my qualifications or my life experience to be able to cope. But you shouldn't have to cope. You shouldn't have to cope.
And it was because I read it in the book, but FIFO was very much, FIFO, we love an acronym, don't we? So I think you
particularly in policing.
Yeah, FIFO, fit in or fuck off. And I think you realised that in the early days that was the situation you were in. How you experienced racism in your early days in the police? One story I'm thinking of is when you were driving your BMW, for example.
Well, I was a young sergeant then, and I was actually a young sergeant in Brixton. So, probably one of the most famous sort of areas of London, incredibly cosmopolitan, very diverse. But if you're a police officer, one of the hardest places to police. And of course, the black community in Brixton has had a very fractious relationship with policing. It's certainly going back many, many decades, but the pivotal moment was the 1981 uprising, as Brixton residents would call it, riots as the government called it at the time, but was a backlash against over-policing. And the over-policing was an operation called Operation Swamp, which was before we professionalised the way we did stop and search. Basically, you could search anyone for any reason at any time without any suspicion whatsoever. And there was a whole thing about robbery in London at the time, and this will sound very familiar to people today, but robbers were being racially profiled as young black boys. So they were all being stopped routinely all of the time. It's probably the start of the whole backlash against stop and search. So when I was a young sergeant, it was just after my first divorce, and I'd managed to club together enough money to buy a car to get me to and from work, which was an old gold BMW. It
makes me smile.
It was in beautiful condition, I have to say. It was a mint car. I still miss it to this day. It was not a banger, but it was old, but it was in good condition. But it was an old gold BMW. And I used to get, for the first time, this hadn't happened to me when I was at Battersea for years, but I was being stopped driving from Brixton back to Tooting, where I lived. So the car's registered to my address in Tooting. I'm driving directly from Brixton Police Station back to Tooting back. The car is in perfect condition. I'm a trained police driver. I'm not doing anything wrong, and yet I would still get stopped. And the funniest thing for me was getting stopped and getting out of the car. I think it was probably for the second or third time that month. It's not as bad as some people get. But I got out of the car, and the van driver who was subbing at Clapham that night was one of my people on my relief. And I got out of the car and went, "Oh, sorry, Skip." And I didn't say anything. I should have challenged him at the time. I should have said, "That's okay, but just explain to me why you've stopped me." Because, of course, he would have had no rationale for stopping me whatsoever.
Of course.
Other than it was a young man of colour driving a BMW through central London. So that kind of thing. And I've said this to colleagues who don't really understand stop and search. They don't understand the effect stop and search has on people who are searched. So I'm probably the only chief constable in the last 2 decades who has been regularly stopped and searched as a child, an adolescent, a young adult, a serving police officer, and the head of counter-terrorism at every airport I've been through since 2001, since 9/11 happened.
And now a successful podcast host, probably.
Well, I'm hoping that doesn't happen, but every time I say that, people get very unnerved by it. The point of me saying it is I understand what it feels like.
Yeah.
And if you're a police officer and you regularly stop and search people, it becomes too much like a routine thing for you. It's normalised for you. It's never normalised for the person you do it to. So just because you've got a reason to do it and you do it legally doesn't necessarily mean it's not incredibly embarrassing or humiliating for the person who stopped. But for me to have experienced what was clearly a bit of racial profiling in Brixton back in the mid-90s, I can talk about it with some authority. I know what these things feel like. I've been stopped and searched my entire life. You can't find many chief constables, the majority of which are white and middle class, who will have experienced that. So in some respects, although it made me sort of laugh at the time, it was a bit grudging because this was leading up to the public inquiry into Stephen Lawrence. So, it was in the years before the whole thing came out about the Met being institutionally racist and how badly we had failed the family in that investigation.
Which is the Macpherson report, isn't
Absolutely.
it? Let's just go back, if we may, a little bit with Stephen Lawrence, because I feel Stephen Lawrence's murder has weaved its way through your career, because the night before your passing out parade in 1993, when you became officially PC Basu and you were polishing your boots.
PC Basu 241 Whiskey Alpha.
241 Whiskey Alpha. That was when an 18-year-old, I think he was an architect student, actually, Stephen, wasn't he? An architect student.
Oh, no, he wanted to be an architect.
Wanted to be an architect. An A-level student lay dying on a street in Eltham, stabbed to death by a group of white lads. Just for those people, Neil, who perhaps don't remember the bare bones of that story, just remind us what happened to Stephen, because I'd like to explore a little bit about how you feel that the police let the family down.
Well, Stephen was nothing but a very, very good A-level student studying in South London, living in Eltham with his family, Doreen and Neville, his parents. Doreen, obviously now Baroness Doreen Lawrence, and his younger brother and sister. And he went out for the evening with a friend of his called Dwayne Brooks. They were out as any two kids would be out, and they were making their way home and were effectively on the other side of the street were five, we now think six, white lads who started to racially abuse them. So they started to run. One or more of them attacked Stephen with a knife, brutally murdered him effectively. He managed to run another 200 yards before he collapsed, which the pathologist at the time said was a testimony to his incredible physical fitness. He should not have been able to do that. His injuries were so catastrophic. And it was purely an evil, racist murder. Dwayne Brooks, his friend who was with him, had managed to get further ahead of Stephen, turn around and realised that what had happened to Stephen, returned to his friend and was obviously, as you would expect, utterly traumatised. The first police officers on scene didn't really know how to apply first aid for injuries of this level and treated Stephen and Dwayne as though they had somehow brought this trouble upon themselves. And that was the first indication that we have no idea how to treat the black community in London if our first thought is two young black boys out together on a night out are somehow troublemakers or somehow involved in something that would have brought this on themselves, as opposed to just being randomly attacked by a bunch of thuggish racists. And what made it even worse was that Eltham was known for being a very racist area, and there had been attacks in that area. So these days, post-Macpherson, those crimes would have been recorded. There would have been some kind of pattern developing. You'd hope. By the way, there have been recent reports of areas of the country where, and particularly a recent conviction for murdering an Indian man in his 80s, where there were a routine series of racist incidents before that murder that were not picked up on by police or recorded. I could go into a whole story about why the Conservative administration didn't want us to record non-crime hate incidents. Here is a good example of why it's important to record every incident so you get a pattern of what's happening in an area. That wasn't happening in Eltham at the time because, as Macpherson would later find out, what developed from there, a murder investigation that wouldn't have raised many eyebrows back at New Scotland Yard. It would have been the murder of an 18-year-old black kid in South London. The Daily Crime Bulletin in the Metropolitan Police is quite dramatic. You can be at any other police force anywhere, certainly in the UK, and you won't see the crimes that are on the Daily Crime Bulletin every day in the Metropolitan Police. There aren't that many of them. It's not a thick document, but there are some major crimes on there. You get used to that level of violent crime. So I think sometimes there can be something of a complacency towards it. I think at this time, I wouldn't have known. I was a young PC just coming out of Battersea. I hope, and I know people who were involved who were very senior at that time who'd be able to answer these questions. I hope questions went right up to the Commissioner about that crime and what was happening about it. Of course, a murder squad was deployed to do what murder squads do, and the Metropolitan Police has a 99% clear-up rate for murder. It's probably the best in the Western world. So we are very good at murder investigations. We weren't very good at this one. So not only were the 5 suspects and potentially a 6th suspect all named by the community in the opening days of the inquiry, but the family were treated as though they must have had some knowledge of this or be suspects. So Doreen and Neville were made to feel like they had somehow been culpable for the death of their son. Those suspect names weren't followed up on, and when they eventually did, we messed up the surveillance operation. And eventually, of course, the trail goes cold and those suspects are not arrested. And then there's years of hurt for the family struggling to get justice for their brutally racist murder of their son. And of course, this was 1993, so I've just become a PC. By the time I get to 1998, I'm a detective sergeant at Brixton Police Station. I get called up to New Scotland Yard to be on a team called the Lawrence Inquiry Team. And this is a team that was responding to the work Lord Macpherson, Sir William as he was then, he was doing his public inquiry that had been commissioned by the Home Secretary Jack Straw, and I was called up along with 5 fellow officers to say, how do we cope if he calls us institutionally racist? We've got a clue. He's going to call us that. What are we doing now, and what do we need to be better at in order to prove to the public that, okay, if we're going to have to accept it, we're going to get better. What do we need to do? And we wrote a document called Protect and Respect, which was the blueprint for what the Met would then do for the next 5 years to try and reverse our image of being institutionally racist. And we did some brilliant things. When you look back on it now, our family liaison now, the way we treated Doreen and Neville back then as the victims of their loved one being murdered, we're probably the world leaders in family liaison now because of that report. That's Stephen's real legacy. The way we train murder squad officers, I was one of the first murder squad senior investigating officers trained through the new system that came in after that to make us better at investigating murder. The way that we do emergency life support, the ability of a police officer to be almost as good as a paramedic at saving your life. All of these things came out of that report. And for 5 years, we really were making a fantastic effort. And then the war on terror occurred.
So how did the war on terror change that and change all those good things that...
This is just a personal theory, because I don't think it was never malicious that we stopped dealing with diversity, equality and inclusion as it would be called today, but back then just diversity. We'd hired a diversity director. We had Ian Blair, who eventually took over from John Stevens. They had a diversity director of 200 people in an organisation of 50,000, but we're everything from our promotion processes to the way we recruited people to these incredible training, the golden hour principles of a first officer on scene being able to manage a crime scene and protect the evidence and make sure that any witness is treated properly, not like Dwayne Brooks was treated. All of this came out of that inquiry. We became much more professional and much better at our jobs. And a lot of money was pumped into that, a lot of money and a lot of training and a lot of effort. But it didn't last. And the reason it didn't last was the war on terror absorbed a great deal of resource and probably the minds and the efforts. And I know this because I later led that and I was later on the management board. I can imagine their minds were not stuck on the great critical incident, the great public inquiry of the past. They were on 7/7 and the 2005 bombings in London. There was a lot to distract us from what I would describe as a generational challenge. If you're going to do something about diversity, you don't do it for a few years and then give up. It doesn't work that way. So as a 57-year-old mixed-race man, I can tell you it takes a lot longer than that to get people to see people of difference as worthy. My theory is we got very sucked into that and other issues at the time, corruption, organised crime. And following that, by the time 2008 comes along, there's another opportunity to pour some money into this and then austerity hits. And the world collapses financially. And policing, just like every other public service, takes a 20% cut across the board. One of the first things to go is diversity, along with communications, along with intelligence, along with really fundamental things you need to do your job. But diversity is the first thing people think, well, we don't need that. And my view on that, and trying to persuade chief constables that if you really understood, why do you want to understand institutional racism? When you admit it and you apologise for it and you tell people that you're going to be different and you're going to make more of an effort, why is that important to you as a police officer? It's morally the right thing to do. I really used to get very upset about being beaten up and abused for being a man of colour or a boy of colour in those days. It's the reason I built myself up into what I built up. I didn't want to be abused anymore and I didn't want to be bullied. But why would you want to do it? Well, in policing, you want intelligence, You want witnesses. You want people to come to court. You want people to obey the law. And most importantly, these days, is it'd be quite nice if people helped our officers when they were getting their heads kicked in on the street. They don't do that. They film it and post it. So if you want the respect of communities, you're going to have to win that back. And that trust and confidence, particularly in the young Black Afro-Caribbean community, has been missing for my entire service. And by the way, today it's the lowest point since we started recording confidence levels.
Is it really?
Yeah. And that has come post Louise Casey and the Casey report. So the National Action Plan that was developed, and I sat on the board to develop it, was a plan that was designed to win the confidence of the black community back. The president of the National Black Police Officers Association has just refused to accept he's a serving officer in the police service of Northern Ireland. He's refused to accept his chief constable's plan because he says it doesn't go far enough, it's too vacuous, it's too vague, it doesn't have any targets in it. So there isn't very much confidence in the plan. But in 2021, just the year before the plan was due to be launched, is when I asked chief constables to accept institutional racism, apologise for it, and then you could launch the action plan as your response to that. They refused to do points 1 and 2, so we're not going to admit institutional racism, we're certainly not going to apologise for it, but we will launch the action plan. And to this day, I don't understand the logic of that.
Why can't they admit it when people like Macpherson and Lady Casey, very clever, bright, intellectual people, have done investigations, Macpherson into the Stephen Lawrence case and Casey into the dreadful, well, all murders are dreadful, into the murder of Sarah Everard, which was by a serving officer in your group of officers. I know you didn't know him, but came under your command. When people like that make that conclusion, how can you not admit that that's the case?
I don't know. You're asking me a question I can't answer.
I don't know. That's a short answer to that one.
But I have a theory, and I think this theory, I can ground this theory. In fact, I was a reasonable detective once, and you can go back to the...
We will talk about your detective work in a moment.
I looked at after I lost the vote in January 2022, I never went to another Chiefs Council again. But I looked at the minutes of the May 2022 National Police Chiefs Council meeting. And in it, diversity is always the last. It's a 2-day agenda. Diversity is always either the last item or the penultimate one when people are switched off.
It's the tick box, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah.
And when you look at what was written there, it was the decision about not accepting institutional racism. And there is a reason why. And it's about the backlash and the media. And it's in one line. It's written by a minute taker who's probably been told, don't write it verbatim. So it's just one line, but I can read between the lines because I know, since I was on the Lawrence Inquiry team in 1998, I know the two greatest fears of chief constables back in those days. Lord Condon, Sir Paul Condon, as he was at the time, was my commissioner. His greatest fear was that no police officer would understand the term institutional racism. They would just assume that they were being individually called racists. And that is the most emotional and difficult thing you can say to anybody. We know that regardless of whether you're a police officer or not. That's true. That happened because we didn't explain to them before Paul Condon effectively wrote his letter in the Telegraph saying I'm admitting institutional racism the day after the report was published. I know that happened because I was one of the authors of that letter. So, and you can Google it and you can see what Paul Condon said, but then go back to his evidence. In his evidence, he was almost combative and quite argumentative with William Macpherson and the panel, because he was worried that all of his officers, there'd be this tremendous backlash from the front line. And you want to keep morale of the front line in a good place. These are people who do run towards danger when everyone is running away. That cliche is true. They do put their lives on the line. They sometimes lose their lives doing that very thing. We want them to have high morale. So I don't want to accuse all of the front line of racism either. That's not what institutional racism is. It's in policies and procedures. These are the things your leaders make you do. The only people who should be ashamed of it are leaders who've allowed the organisation to get into a place where it promotes policies and procedures that have disproportionate outcomes if you're a person of colour or you're a woman or you're gay. And that's what's happened for years, but the leadership hasn't acknowledged or accepted it. And the second thing is they feared a media backlash. So they thought the media would say, well, there you go, you're a bunch of racists. That would have happened, and it would have happened for about, in this day and age, 24 hours.
It's pretty sobering to hear you say that. After all these years, decades even, the leadership still hasn't acknowledged or accepted institutional racism. We've covered such a lot in part one of our special, so we'll leave it on that insightful thought for now.
Excellent.
Join me next week when I'll be exploring some of the big cases Neil worked on, hearing about his time running counter-terror, the pressures of the job on mental health, and what he misses about life, quotes, in the room, at the heart of the Met.